My name is Dave Kiyvyra, Director of Development for Lindamood-Bell for Schools. Welcome to the latest Leaders in Literacy webinar. In this webinar, we'll be joined by Dr. Robert Pasternack, former Assistant Secretary for Special Education at the United States Department of Education. We're going to be watching some highlights of several conversations we had with Dr. Pasternack. Dr. Pasternack was one of the leaders in really pushing the idea of response to intervention, RTI, as a means of identifying students at need for special education services, and also as a means for providing the instruction students need to get so that hopefully they don't have to go into special education. And Dr. Pasternack's going to talk about response to intervention and the structure of it and how it can be used. But he's going to start our conversation talking a little bit about what the situation is for reading post-pandemic, why it is that so many students struggle with reading. Then we'll talk about response to intervention, and he'll wrap up talking about the difference between high-impact tutoring and intensive intervention. Hope you'll enjoy this webinar and come back and watch some more of our Leaders in Literacy webinar series. Thank you and enjoy.
Sadly, for too many students, reading instruction in many schools across the country is based on the mistaken belief that if kids are read to a great deal, then reading should come pretty easily for them. So many of the folks who are on the webinar undoubtedly are aware of balanced literacy being the prevailing model that's used across the country. I've heard balanced literacy very aptly described as trying to balance two empty pans. Folks know that whole language is still in wide use, despite the amassed data that suggests that whole language is not the way to teach kids who struggle to learn how to read. And the teacher's role in other approaches is mainly to guide students to create an environment that's conducive to learning how to read, setting up reading groups, reading with students, helping them find books on their reading level. These are models that are in wide use across the country. And folks like Lucy Calkins, who's been at Teachers College at Columbia University in New York, is trying to revise her approach to teaching reading. There are a lot of folks are aware of the fact that these prevailing models that are still in wide use are not based on what we are describing now as the science of reading. That really comes, Dave, as you know, from the National Reading Panel studies that were done many years ago under the Bush administration. As you well know, some of the professional development models that are in wide use are what is described as program agnostic. So they do not do what you just suggested is so important, in that they do not provide teachers with a specific program to implement as part of that professional development. And that's one of the things that differentiates the professional development that Lindamood-Bell does so well. And it's so critically important to give teachers not only the grounding in the science of how kids learn how to read, why some kids struggle to learn how to read it, and then the more important thing, what to do with those kids who are struggling, since the preceding slide showed how many students we're really talking about. And when I was teaching first grade, I was not trained well in how to teach students who were struggling to learn how to read, and sadly that hasn't improved, and this is 50 years later. Well, the number one reason why kids are referred to special education across the country is their failure to learn how to read. And the second reason is behavior problems. And the number one reason why students exhibit behavior problems is because they struggle to learn how to read. And out of the 13 categories of eligibility for special education under IDEA, the largest category in school districts that are across the country, and the folks who are on the webinar can go ahead and check with their special education director to make sure that in their school district that in fact that this is what's happening, is the category of kids with specific learning disabilities. And what you were alluding to, Dave, is that I often have said that those students, many of them are not students with specific learning disabilities. They are, in fact, students with ABT, which stands for that they ain't been taught. And that is all too often why these kids are struggling, is because they haven't been taught by teachers who were trained to implement a evidence-based program with fidelity and treatment integrity that's designed to teach struggling kids how to read. What we do know, Dave, is that not being able to read fundamentally changes a student's trajectory, both academically and socially, emotionally, and post-school as well. And so what we're worried about is that the fallout from the pandemic threatens to depress this generation's prospects far into the future and far into their impending adulthood. We're worried that we've constricted their opportunities because of the fact that they have not gotten the instruction that they were entitled to receive because they haven't been in school. We know that more first and second graders ended last school year 2 or more grade levels below expectations than in any previous year. And given the major strides that kids at this age typically make in mastering reading and the critical importance of early reading for later academic success, this is a particular concern. And that really relates to Joe Torgeson's important work, where he found that the amount of effort that we need to put into changing a child's trajectory after third grade is way more than the amount of effort that we could put into that changing that child's trajectory before third grade. So early intervention works. Early intervention is critically important no matter what human malady we are trying to address, and that is particularly true for reading as well. So we got RTI language, as Dave mentioned, into IDEA for the first time since 1975. That was back in 2004. Subsequent to President Bush signing IDEA, as you all know, the Education and Secondary Education Act, which began in 1965, got reauthorized when President Bush was in office, and it was called the No Child Left Behind, which some of you may remember, fondly, I hope. But then the Congress, after that, reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act again, and it was called the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. And in ESSA, you do not see language about response to intervention and instruction. What you see is this term, a multi-tiered system of supports. And that's really about how do we create a system which is designed to address the needs of all of the students in the school district who are struggling. And you want to base that on assessment. Got to have, if there's another way to know how kids are learning other than assessment, I don't know what it is. Can you go back to the previous slide for just a second? About that. Thank you very much. We want to make sure that we are making decisions based on data. I shared with you earlier about, sadly, reading instruction is too often driven by people's beliefs rather than the science. If you make, I'm a database policymaker, and I hope that all of you as teachers are using progress monitoring data to determine whether your students are responding effectively to the instruction that you are providing. You want to have multi-level instruction. You want to make sure that the district has the infrastructure and support that you need to implement a system of multi-tiered systems of support, and whatever program it is that you choose to use, you want to make sure that you are implementing that program with what we call fidelity, treatment integrity, and that you are in fact evaluating the impact of the services that you are providing and the interventions that you are providing to the students who are struggling.
Great. So some of the things that you want to see coming out of that sort of structure, Bob?
We want to increase, the goal is to increase academic achievement for all students. And I think it's important to remind everyone that every student with a disability is first a general education student. It's something that you were getting to earlier, Dave. And I think we often forget that, and that special ed and general ed are not two separate systems. They're actually part of the same system. And we need to have a system in place that is designed to increase academic achievement for everyone, for all students. We want to make sure we're having collaboration between general ed and special ed. We want to make sure that we have a unified framework of academics and behavioral support in place in the district and in every classroom, and that you have instructional leadership at the building level provided by the principal. You want to make sure that resources are allocated based on needs, And by the way, we've never seen as many resources, particularly financial resources. We've never seen this much money in public education in the history of our country. The rescue plan and the ESSER money, these are incredibly large infusions of money into the education system. We want to make sure that the assessment that's being done is not discriminatory, and that we have policies and procedures and practices in place that ensure that there's equity and that we are not discriminating against any kids. And that's why for many, many years now, I've been advocating that we spend less time giving meaningless IQ tests, because IQ is, as we know, is racially discriminatory and does not predict subsequent academic success. And too often, as you well know, Dave, that we see high rates of referrals for special education. We see districts where 25%, 30% of their students are being receiving special education services, way higher than the national numbers of 14%. So I think that these are just some reasons why we want to make sure that you all are implementing a multi-tiered systems of support in your school district. All of the people, I would think, on the call know that 40 states have now enacted legislation to require that all students be screened for the signs and symptoms of dyslexia. That's what universal screening is all about in those 40 states. And I think the concern that folks are having in these 40 states is that we are seeing a lot of students being identified as having dyslexia. Then the question becomes, what do we do to really serve those students well and effectively? And we've already talked about the fact that sadly, teachers are not trained to know what to do in too many instances. And we've got a lot of kids and the question is, are they really being appropriately identified or are they being misidentified? They really don't have dyslexia. And for those students that really do have dyslexia, we want to make sure that they are getting specially designed instruction and teachers are using evidence-based strategies with fidelity and treatment integrity. On the one side, we talk about RTI-A, or the academic side of response to intervention and instruction. On the other side, we talk about RTI-B, which is the behavioral side of RTI. And as I was mentioning earlier, the RTI as a paradigm can be used for both academic and behavioral, to address both academic and behavioral issues in kids. This is the triangle that is often used to depict graphically what RTI should look like. I would hope that people would not pay attention to the percentages that are in each one of the parts of the triangle or the pyramid, but rather realize that most students, if not all students, start out in general education. That's the green, that's the universal instruction. You want it to be preventative and proactive. Then that's tier one. Tier two is targeted group interventions for just some students. So we usually can depict this as the green would be all, the yellow would be some, the red would be few. But tier two would be for some students. You would want to use interventions with high efficiency, and you would want to make sure that the system is providing a rapid response for students who are struggling. And then tier three is intensive, individualized intervention. It can be for small groups, but it's typically, we talk about specially designed instruction for individual students. And it's really important for folks to remember that tier three is not synonymous with special education. All of the tiers are a prelude to gathering progress monitoring data to determine whether the interventions are being effective. And if you've got a student who has not responded to interventions that began in tier one, provided in tier two, continued to be more intensely individually provided in tier three, and you've gathered progress monitoring data in each one of those tiers, then you are in a very good position to be able to say that you think that the student should be referred for the comprehensive multidisciplinary evaluation that would lead to answering two questions. The first question is, does the student have a disability? And if the answer to that question is yes, then the second question is, does that student need special education? And the same thing can be said for behavior, and you can see the graphic there. We need at this juncture to talk about the dose-response interaction. And people will think about any medical problems that they may have. If they go to the doctor and they have particular symptoms, and the doctor then describes medication, and if the medication is not having the desired effect, typically the doctor will increase the dosage of that medication. The same holds true in education. We do not provide a sufficient dosage of intervention to really be able to address the academic and behavioral needs of students who have significant academic and behavioral needs. And one of the things that I've always been impressed by with Lindamood-Bell and the work that you and your colleagues do, and what Nancy has done so well for so many years, is recognize that if we're going to be effective, it's high dose is what's required. And so in the clinics across the world that you all do, I know that they're talking about 4 hours a day of intervention with someone who's trained in your strategies. That's the kind of dose-response interaction that we never see in public schools. You know, the resource room model, as folks on the webinar know, we pull a kid out of the core, and we then send that kid to receive a reading intervention from a teacher who's had less training on how to teach reading, and the student is missing the opportunity to get instruction in the core. And what should be happening is that the student should be staying in the core, hopefully even through osmosis, that student would get some benefit from sitting in the core instruction that's being provided. And then in either tier 2 or tier 3, then that student would receive intervention that supplements what the student is not getting out of the core program. So I think the point you made, Dave, is so critically important, and is one of the reasons why special ed is not so special for the vast majority of mildly disabled students who receive special ed across the country. And I think the data will support that. These are quickly some guiding questions that folks can think about as they go back to their districts and classrooms after the webinar and look at their multi-tiered systems of support. Is the core program sufficient? If it's not sufficient, why isn't it? How will the needs identified in the core be addressed? How will the effectiveness and efficiency of the core be monitored over time? Have improvements to the core been effective? For what students in the core, which students in the core, is the core program sufficient and not sufficient, and why? What specific supplemental and intensive instruction is needed? And that's just what we were talking about. How are you going to identify what program you're going to provide in tier 2 and in tier 3? And then the critical importance of progress monitoring. You've got to go ahead and monitor the progress that students are making, so that you know whether your intervention is in fact being effective. And if it's not, then you can change your instruction, whether it's the delivery, whether it's in fact the program, or whether it's just the intensity of it, the individuality, individuation of it. These are things that good teachers know. How will the supplemental and intensive instruction be delivered? How will effectiveness of supplemental and intensive instruction be monitored? And what students or which students need to move to a different level of instruction? Those are questions that are going to help you really move through the different tiers, because as I said, and as you all know, every student is in tier 1, but then you have those students who are struggling go into tier 2 and hopefully are making enough progress to be able to return full-time to tier 1. If not, you're going to have some students who are going to need to go to more intensive instruction, and that's tier 3. And then, as I said, you will have success, hopefully, with many students. But for those students who are not having success, you're going to have sufficient data to be able to then lead to the comprehensive multidisciplinary evaluation required to determine whether the student has a disability and might need special ed. Well, I think as we wrap up the webinar today, we wanted to kind of make sure that folks understand the differentiation between tutoring and intervention, and that tutoring is not intervention. That improvements to remote and hybrid learning, by the way, have had less impact in reading than they did in math. And again, we don't really know how significant the differences have been, how much learning loss has occurred, how much learning recovery is taking place, but we are concerned about the fact that tutoring may not be achieving the kind of improvements in academic performance that is hoped. And the point that you were making about the dose-response interaction, and again, whether it's high impact or high dose, that's a difference from a lot of the ways that tutoring is being provided across the country. And folks on the webinar will remember perhaps when they received tutoring. And it was to buttress the kind of instruction that was not giving them the information that they needed when they were in school. And that's not what the students who have lost so much academic skill need in order to regain, and we're not seeing the kind of acceleration in learning because tutoring has not re-engaged students and hasn't re-enrolled them into effective learning programs, but we want to make sure that we are giving them research-based, evidence-based, proven effective interventions. We want to also make sure that we're supporting students in recovering their unfinished learning and meeting their broader needs using intervention. And this was really trying to get folks to recognize that tutoring, you mentioned high impact tutoring. I don't want to say that tutoring never works, but we want to be careful about thinking that tutoring is the kind of panacea that it is not.